What started as a small, beautiful piece of history, an innocent discovery, has become something else entirely. And in the quiet of the night, in the shadows that now feel alive, I can't help but wonder, what has that locket brought into our lives? What has it awakened? Because some things don't belong in the light. And when you bring them back, they bring part of the darkness with them. My roommate, his name's Liam, has a fascination for old, forgotten things. It's probably worth mentioning that my roommate Liam isn't like most people. He has this magnetic pull towards strange, forgotten places. If there's an abandoned house, he wants to explore it. If there's an estate sale in some decaying part of town, he'll be the first one there, sifting through mementos of lives long past, searching for things others would leave behind. He has this restless curiosity, this sense that each object holds a story. And to him, those stories are like buried treasure. We'd been living together for almost a year when he found the locket. It was a rainy Thursday evening when he came back with it, his face practically glowing with excitement. He dropped his bag by the door, barely glanced at me, and pulled it out of his pocket, holding it up like it was some grand discovery. I still remember the way it looked in his hand, small and delicate, yet somehow heavy. It was an old-fashioned piece, tarnished silver with intricate carvings wrapping around the edges. In the center was a symbol I couldn't quite make out. It looked like a mix of letters and shapes, maybe a language, or maybe just something abstract. Either way, it didn't feel random. There was a purpose to it, like it had been placed there to convey something, though what I couldn't tell. "Look at this," he said, his voice filled with an almost childlike wonder. He turned it over in his hand, watching the way the dim light caught on the worn silver, as if he couldn't believe it was real. I found it in the back of this thrift shop, buried under a pile of old magazines and broken picture frames. Can you believe no one wanted this? It's beautiful. Beautiful. That's the word he used. But I couldn't help feeling differently. There was something about it, something I couldn't quite place, but that made me uneasy from the moment I saw it. It was subtle, almost like a quiet hum just below the level of hearing, an almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to thicken the air around it. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as a weird first impression, but the feeling stayed, stubborn and heavy, gnawing at the back of my mind. "You don't think it's, I don't know, weird?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though something about the way he was looking at it made my skin prickle. He didn't even glance up, his eyes fixed on the locket, tracing the strange symbol over and over with his finger, as if he were memorizing it. "Weird. No, it's," he paused, searching for the right word. "It feels important, like it's been waiting for someone to find it." Those words hung in the air, and for a moment, the apartment felt colder. I laughed it off, told him he sounded like a character in a horror movie, but the laugh didn't come naturally. There was something about that locket that just felt wrong, and yet, I couldn't deny its strange allure. I'd catch myself glancing at it when I thought he wasn't looking, studying the way it seemed to drink in the light, almost as if it had a life of its own. Liam started wearing it around his neck, letting it hang just beneath his shirt, where it rested close to his heart. He joked about it, calling it his good luck charm, but there was a glint in his eyes, a sort of reverence that made me wonder if he was more serious than he let on. He'd reach up and touch it sometimes, absent-mindedly, almost like a habit. And each time he did, I felt that same heavy, suffocating presence press in on me, as though the room had shrunk, as if something unseen were watching us, measuring us. Days went by, and the air in our apartment grew thicker, almost oppressive. Small things began to happen, things that were easy to dismiss individually, but together, they began to paint a picture I couldn't ignore. Lights flickered at odd times, even though we'd just changed the bulbs. Shadows seemed to stretch a little longer than they should have, lingering in the corners even after the light shifted. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But late at night, I'd lie in bed, wide awake, feeling a tension I couldn't explain, a sensation that something was wrong, that something had shifted in our home. One night, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing, though I didn't know why. My room was pitch black, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something, a faint, silvery glint just outside my door, like the reflection of moonlight on metal. It took me a moment to realize what it was, the locket, swinging gently from Liam's hand. He was standing in the doorway, staring at it, his face obscured by shadow, and for a second he looked almost unfamiliar, like a stranger in his own skin. "Liam," I whispered, but he didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. He just stood there, motionless, the locket swaying slightly, as if something invisible were holding it, guiding it back and forth. In the morning, he acted like nothing had happened. I tried to bring it up, but he shrugged it off, said he must have been sleepwalking. But the look in his eyes told me something different. He seemed distant, distracted, as though a part of him was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. And from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever part of him had gone was now tied to that locket, bound to it in some strange, unbreakable way. I tried to ignore it, to push down the creeping dread that had settled over me like a weight. But every time I saw the locket, every time he touched it, I felt it a silent, chilling presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. And in the quiet of our apartment, I began to wonder if he was right. If maybe, somehow, that locket really had been waiting for him. And if it had, what else had it brought with it? Because some things don't belong to us, no matter how beautiful they appear. Some things come with a price that isn't paid in gold or silver, but in pieces of ourselves. And as I watched Liam change, bit by bit, I began to fear that whatever had been waiting in that dusty corner of the thrift shop had finally found what it was looking for. And it wasn't about to let go. It started out slowly, almost subtly enough that I could have dismissed it as nothing. The kinds of things you don't notice right away. A cold draft drifting through the hallway, even though the windows were closed. The sudden creak of a door swinging open by itself, echoing through the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. But these weren't the familiar sounds of an old building settling. No, these sounds felt deliberate, as though something unseen was quietly testing its presence, waiting for us to notice. At first, I thought I was alone in sensing it. I tried to shrug it off, rationalize it, tell myself it was all in my head. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. There was a chill in the apartment now, a sharp coldness that would pass over certain rooms at random, lingering just long enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. Sometimes, I'd walk into the kitchen and feel an icy breath against the back of my neck, as though someone were standing just behind me, so close I could almost feel them. Liam noticed it too. One evening he walked into the living room, rubbing his arms and muttering, "Is it me, or is it freezing in here?" He tried to laugh it off, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. There was no reason for the apartment to be that cold. But every time I checked, the thermostat was perfectly fine. No drafts, no open windows. Just that strange, bone-deep chill that seemed to come and go as it pleased. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, just a faint shuffle, as if someone were pacing down the hall late at night. The kind of sound that's almost too quiet to be sure of, but loud enough to keep you awake, straining to listen, wondering if it's real. I'd lie there in bed, listening, heart pounding as the sound came closer, each step deliberate, heavy. And when I'd finally get up to check, I'd find nothing but empty rooms, silent and undisturbed, as if the sound had only existed in my mind. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. Those footsteps were real, I was certain of it. And whoever or whatever was making them wasn't in any rush. The worst, though, were the nights. That's when the dreams began. It started with Liam. One morning, he stumbled into the kitchen, his face pale, his hands shaking as he clutched a mug of coffee. I asked him if he was okay, and he just nodded, though his eyes had this haunted look to them, as if he'd seen something he couldn't forget. He finally told me in a low, unsteady voice about the dream. He'd been standing in the apartment, alone, in complete darkness. Everything felt wrong, as if he were somewhere familiar yet twisted, corrupted. He could hear something moving in the shadows, just beyond his sight, circling him, whispering his name. And then he saw a figure in the dark, barely visible, but there, watching him, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. It held out a hand toward him, beckoning, and he felt a pull, a deep, almost hypnotic urge to reach out and take it. And just as he was about to, he woke up, drenched in sweat, heart racing. I tried to comfort him, told him it was probably just a nightmare. But later that week, I had the same dream. It started the same way, me, alone in the apartment, surrounded by an unnatural darkness that pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't see anything, couldn't move, just stood there frozen as something whispered from the shadows. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably real. It kept repeating one word over and over, leave. At first I thought it was speaking to me, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't me, it was warning. It was warning about the locket. And then, just like in Liam's dream, I saw a figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing across the room, its head tilted, its gaze fixed on me. It was watching, waiting, as if daring me to move, to break the silence. And as I stared, its face shifted, morphed, taking on a shape that was almost familiar, almost human, but horribly wrong. I felt my hand reaching out, as if on its own, drawn to that darkness, compelled by something beyond my control. And just as our hands nearly touched, I woke, gasping for breath, the echo of that word still ringing in my ears, leave. After that, the nightmares only grew worse. Each time they felt more vivid, more real, as if the line between dream and reality was thinning, fraying at the edges. We both started avoiding sleep, drinking coffee late into the night, trying to stay awake, anything to escape those dreams. But sleep always found us, and when it did, the darkness was there, waiting, creeping closer with each visit. The figure was no longer just watching. It was whispering, its words thick with a hatred I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a terror so deep it felt primal. One night, I woke suddenly, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The room was pitch black, save for a faint glow from the hallway. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something in the corner. A shape, a shadow, darker than the rest, standing impossibly still. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. But I could feel it there, watching me, its presence cold and oppressive. I blinked, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me, cold, empty, filled with a malice that seemed to reach into my soul. And then, it was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there. But the room felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I sat there, paralyzed, listening to the silence, half expecting to hear those footsteps, to see those eyes again. But there was nothing. Just me, alone in the darkness, with the echo of that figure's gaze lingering in my mind, a reminder that whatever was haunting us was no longer content to stay hidden. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that I hadn't really seen anything. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was haunting us, whatever had come with that locket, was getting stronger, and it was no longer satisfied with staying in the shadows. It wanted something more, and it wasn't about to let us go. From that point on, the strange occurrences didn't just continue, they intensified, creeping into every part of our daily lives, as if the apartment itself was beginning to change. It was no longer just about cold spots or flickering lights. There was a new element, something that felt physical, tangible. I'd walk through the hallway, and suddenly there'd be this overwhelming smell, sharp and metallic, like rusted iron or old blood, lingering in the air. I'd search the walls, the floors, even the pipes, thinking there must be a logical explanation. But the smell would vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing behind except that gnawing unease in my gut. It wasn't just the smell, either. I started noticing faint scratches along the walls, thin, jagged lines that seemed to appear overnight. They weren't the sort you'd get from furniture scraping against the wall. These were different, deliberate, almost as if something with sharp, claw-like fingers had been dragging itself through our apartment, leaving faint reminders of its presence. Each morning I'd find new ones tracing patterns along the walls, sometimes reaching up toward the ceiling. And no matter how many times I tried to scrub them off, they'd reappear, deeper, darker, as if whatever was behind them was growing bolder, more insistent. Liam seemed oblivious to all of it, or maybe he was just pretending not to notice. But he was changing, too, in ways I couldn't ignore. He'd always been pale, but now his skin looked almost translucent, with dark circles under his eyes that grew darker by the day. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and he moved slower, like someone under a heavy weight. He barely slept, and when he did, it was restless, plagued by those same nightmares that haunted both of us. Yet, in the rare moments when he wasn't lost in those dark dreams, he'd clutch the locket to his chest, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It makes me feel safe," he whispered one night when I asked him about it, his voice hollow, detached, as though he were speaking from somewhere far away. His gaze was unfocused, staring past me, through me. I wanted to pry it away from him, to tell him it was anything but safe. But every time I reached out to touch it, he'd recoil, his eyes flashing with a fierceness that sent chills down my spine. He began to spend more time in front of the mirror in his room, staring at his own reflection, sometimes for hours. I'd hear him muttering to himself, words I couldn't quite catch, fragments of sentences that made no sense. But there was one thing I kept hearing him say, over and over, in a voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "The woman in the mirror, she's waiting for me." I tried to ask him about it, to get him to explain. But he'd just look at me, confused, like he didn't remember saying it at all. And then he'd touch the locket, his fingers tracing the strange symbol etched into its surface, and that faraway look would return to his eyes, as if he were slipping away into some hidden world, drawn deeper and deeper into its pull. The atmosphere in our apartment became suffocating, thick with an invisible pressure that weighed down on us, making it hard to breathe. Every night I'd lie in bed, my heart racing, my skin prickling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, too low to understand, but unmistakably there, coming from the walls, from the shadows, from the locket that never left Liam's side. Then came the night when I saw him standing in front of his mirror. I'd woken up suddenly, my body tense, the room cold and silent. But something felt off. I could feel it, that electric hum in the air, that sense of wrongness that sent a chill down my spine. I crept out of bed, drawn by some impulse I couldn't explain, and made my way to his room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. There he was, standing motionless in front of his mirror, his body rigid, his face pale and expressionless. He was holding the locket in one hand, gripping it so tightly his fingers had turned almost purple. His lips were moving, but the words he was muttering were unlike anything I'd heard before. A strange, guttural language that sounded ancient, unnatural, as though it had been pulled from the depths of some forgotten realm. His eyes were fixed on his reflection, but there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't explain. The image in the mirror seemed darker, shadowed, almost as if it were alive, staring back at him with a gaze that was no longer his own. I wanted to call out to him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in. But I was frozen, rooted to the spot, a sense of dread clawing at my throat, holding me back. And then, in the faint glow of the moonlight, I saw her, the woman in the mirror. She was standing just behind him, her form faint, transparent, but unmistakably there. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to drink in the light, and her mouth was twisted into a cold, hollow smile. She reached out, her hand brushing his shoulder, her fingers lingering on his skin, as though she were claiming him, marking him as her own. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. Liam blinked, his trance broken, and turned to see me standing there. His eyes were wide, unfocused, his face pale with a fear I'd never seen before. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. And for a moment, we just stood there, both of us caught in the grip of a terror we couldn't put into words. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. She's getting closer," he said, his eyes haunted, his voice trembling. And then he turned away, his hand still clutching the locket, his gaze distant, as if he were already slipping back into that shadowy world that had claimed him. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I felt it again, that presence, that silent watcher lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I could feel it pressing in on me, wrapping itself around me like a shroud, filling the room with a cold, unrelenting darkness. And in the silence, I heard her voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering from the shadows, calling out to him, drawing him deeper and deeper into her world. Whatever that locket had brought into our lives, it was no longer content to remain hidden. It wanted more. And with every passing day, every sleepless night, I could feel it closing in, drawing us both into its grip, one haunting breath at a time. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing you're sharing your home with a presence that you can't see, but you can feel. Something that lurks just out of sight, always one step ahead, leaving faint reminders of itself, the icy breath on the back of your neck, the almost invisible scratches along the walls, the strange whispers that fade the moment you try to listen. It's the kind of fear that sinks into your bones, that keeps you wide awake at night, staring into the dark, wondering if you'll see something staring back. But here's the thing, the fear wasn't enough to make me get rid of the locket. I had my chance. There were nights when I'd hold it, feeling its strange weight in my hand, the cold metal almost pulsing like a heartbeat. I'd imagine myself tossing it out, throwing it into a river, burying it somewhere it would never be found. But every time something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was denial, or maybe it was just plain foolishness. So I have to ask, if you found an old locket and strange things started happening, would you keep it? Or would you do what I should have done and get rid of it before it was too late? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes our choices have consequences we can't even begin to understand. And as for me and Liam, I thought I understood what was happening, that it was just a haunting, a curse. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the truth about that locket or the twisted story behind it. The fear had become unbearable. Each night, the locket's influence seemed to deepen, twisting the familiar spaces of our apartment into something unrecognizable, dark and heavy. And Liam, whatever hold that locket had on him, was stronger than anything I'd ever seen. His eyes were hollow, his voice a whisper, his every movement slower, as if he were under an invisible weight. I knew I had to learn more about it, find some explanation for what was happening. Something about that locket had to make sense. I decided to go back to the thrift shop. Maybe they could tell me where it had come from, who had brought it in, or why it felt so impossibly ancient and angry. The shop was dim and cluttered, just as I remembered, the air thick with the musty scent of old books and forgotten relics. As I approached the counter, an elderly woman with a face weathered by time looked up at me with a knowing expression, her eyes narrowing the moment I mentioned the locket. She told me that it had been found in an old estate, tucked away in a box of belongings left behind by a woman named Evelyn Delacroix, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances more than a century ago. Evelyn had lived alone after her husband's tragic death in a fire, and locals believed she never recovered, her spirit lingering in grief, desperate for something or someone she had lost. They said she was last seen standing by her window, holding a locket with an engraving of her husband's initials, gazing out into the night, waiting for him to come back. Days later, she vanished, leaving behind only that locket and a home filled with an unnatural cold. The woman behind the counter handed me a faded envelope filled with brittle newspaper clippings and black and white photos. Her voice hushed as she told me, "You should have left it where you found it. Some things don't belong to the living." Her words echoed in my mind as I opened the envelope and spread the clippings out on a nearby table, each article and photograph pulling me deeper into Evelyn's tragic story. The clippings told of a young woman, beautiful and haunting, whose love for her husband was so fierce it seemed to consume her. After his death, neighbors claimed they heard her weeping late into the night, whispering to someone only she could see. She was said to have been seen in mirrors, her reflection lingering long after she'd turned away, her face twisted with sorrow. Rumors spread about her obsession with the locket, a piece of her husband that she clung to even in death. People whispered that her spirit had remained trapped by her grief, her presence bound to that locket, still seeking her lost love. They said that anyone who wore it could hear her voice in the dark, that her sorrow was so deep it reached through time, calling out to the living, drawing them into her misery. As I left the shop, clutching the envelope, the weight of Evelyn's story pressed down on me, a dark certainty taking root in my mind. Whatever Liam had brought home wasn't just a trinket, a piece of history. It was a gateway, a vessel for something far older and darker, something that had waited a century for someone to find it, someone to share in its curse. When I returned to the apartment, my hands were shaking, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't suppress. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight that awaited me inside. Liam was sitting on the floor, the room cloaked in shadows, the locket hanging from his neck, casting a faint, eerie glint in the dim light. He looked worse than ever pale, his skin almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. His clothes hung loosely on his frame and his breathing was shallow, labored, as though he were struggling to draw breath. But it was his eyes that terrified me most. They were glassy, unfocused, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. It was as if he were no longer entirely there, as though something had reached inside him, hollowing him out, leaving behind only a shell. As I stepped closer, he finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a look so vacant, so void of recognition, that it felt like I was staring at a stranger. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "She's coming for me," he murmured, his hand clutching the locket, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "She says she's waited long enough. I can see her, in the mirror." My stomach twisted as he looked past me, his gaze fixated on something behind my shoulder, his expression one of sheer terror. I turned, my heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror, a fleeting shadow, a faint, ghostly outline of a woman's face, her eyes hollow, her lips twisted in a sorrowful smile. She was there just for a moment, her gaze piercing, filled with an emotion so raw, so overwhelming, that it left me frozen in place, unable to move or speak. And then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone, leaving only the faintest whisper lingering in the air, a sound so soft it barely registered, yet chilling enough to leave me paralyzed with dread. Evelyn was real, her spirit bound to that locket, drawn to anyone who dared touch it, claiming there as her own. Liam's voice broke the silence, his words barely audible. She says I'm next, that I can't hide, that she'll find me wherever I go. Because in Evelyn's world, death was not the end, and she would wait, forever if necessary, until she found what she had lost. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by Evelyn's story and the image of her face in the mirror, a face twisted with such sorrow, such desperation, that it seemed to reach across time itself. My mind raced, torn between fear for Liam and a growing sense of helplessness. How could we escape something that had already claimed him, that had seeped into the very walls around us? The silence of the apartment was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional creak, the faint whisper of air moving through the cracks, and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock. But then, around midnight, the silence was shattered. A scream, raw and filled with agony, tore through the stillness, echoing through the apartment, making my blood run cold. It was Liam. I leapt out of bed, heart pounding, and ran to his room, my mind racing with visions of what I might find. The door was slightly open, and as I pushed it wide, the scene that awaited me was worse than anything I could have imagined. Liam was standing in front of his mirror, his face contorted in terror, his eyes wild and unfocused. His hands were clawing at his own reflection, his nails scraping against the glass with a sound that made my skin crawl. He was shouting, his voice hoarse, desperate, she's here, she won't leave." His fingers left streaks of blood on the glass as he scratched and tore, as if trying to dig something or someone out of the mirror itself. I rushed to him, grabbing his arms, pulling him back from the mirror, but he fought against me, his gaze fixed on his reflection, as if something inside the glass was holding him captive. "Liam, stop. You're hurting yourself," I shouted, but he barely seemed to hear me, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, he turned to face me, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, his expression one of pure horror. "She won't leave me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's here, she's always here, in the mirror waiting." Desperate to help him, to break the hold that Locket had on him, I reached for it, grasping the cold metal in my hand. "We have to destroy this, Liam," I said, my voice barely steady. "This Locket, it's not safe. Whatever's happening to you, it's because of this thing. If we get rid of it, maybe we can make her leave. Maybe we can end this." For the first time, Liam seemed to consider it, his grip loosening as he looked down at the Locket, his expression wavering. The room grew eerily silent, the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifting, if only slightly. I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile sense of calm, as if we were finally taking control, finally finding a way to fight back against whatever darkness had followed him home. But just as that feeling began to settle over us, a sound broke the silence, a low, sinister whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A voice, soft yet filled with an undeniable malice, whispered, "It's too late." The words froze us in place, our breaths catching, our hearts pounding. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the voice echoed, weaving through the room like a living thing, wrapping around us in a suffocating embrace. And then, slowly, chillingly, our reflections in the mirror began to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint shift in the shadows, a darkening around the edges of the glass. But as we watched, horrified, the figures in the mirror took on a life of their own, twisting and distorting, their faces stretching into expressions of fear and anguish. Liam's reflection grinned back at him, a smile that was far too wide, filled with a cold, malevolent glee. And beside it, another figure appeared, a shadowy, ghostly form, its face blurred, its eyes hollow, yet unmistakably the face of Evelyn. Her grin was a grotesque mimicry of Liam's, her eyes fixed on him with a hunger that seemed to pierce through the glass, reaching for him, drawing him in. I felt a wave of terror so profound it rooted me to the spot, my mind reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. The shadow of Evelyn seemed to grow darker, more solid, her form pressing against the surface of the mirror, as if she were straining to break free, to pull herself into our world. I reached for Liam, desperate to pull him away, but he was transfixed, his gaze locked on the mirror, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. His hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the glass, drawn to her, as if under a spell. "Liam." I shouted, my voice choked with fear, but he didn't respond. He was lost, ensnared by her, unable to break free. And then, as if sensing my presence, Evelyn's gaze shifted. Her hollow eyes turned to me, her grin widening, stretching into something impossibly twisted, filled with a malice so intense it felt like it could consume me. She leaned closer, her face pressing against the glass, and for a moment, I thought she would break through, that she would tear through the mirror and pull us both into her world. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the air thick with a darkness that felt alive, pulsating with an unrelenting fury. As I backed away, her shadow in the mirror followed, her twisted grin never wavering, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, in one final, horrifying moment, her face filled the mirror, blocking out all light, all reflection, leaving only her grinning, reaching, her hand pressing against the glass, as if she were mere inches from breaking through. The last thing I saw before the screen cut to black was her shadow, a dark, towering form looming over Liam's reflection, her hand reaching out, her fingers inches away from his, her smile widening as she whispered, "You're mine now." The terror in that room lingered long after Evelyn's shadow vanished from the mirror. I could feel her presence, dark and unyielding, pressing in on us, and as I looked at Liam, I realized he was slipping further away, drawn into her haunting grasp. Desperation clawed at me. If we didn't act now, I knew we would lose him. In a frantic search for answers, I scoured every corner of the internet, combing through sites on hauntings, paranormal curses, anything that could help us sever the Locket's connection to Evelyn's tormented spirit. Finally, I found something, a cleansing ritual, an ancient practice meant to rid objects of malevolent spirits and purify cursed belongings. It was dangerous, but it felt like our only chance. I showed it to Liam, and though he was weak, his skin almost translucent, his eyes distant, he nodded. He was as desperate as I was, willing to try anything to end this nightmare. So that night, just after midnight, we gathered the few items we needed: salt, candles, sage, a vial of holy water, and a small, ornate knife we'd found listed as essential to the ritual. The air in the apartment felt heavy, charged with a tension that prickled against my skin, as if the very walls knew what we were planning. The faint smell of metal hung in the air, that same rusted scent that seemed to follow the locket, thick and sour, filling the room with a sense of dread. We started by lighting the candles and arranging them in a circle around the locket, which lay on the floor, casting a faint, ominous gleam in the flickering candlelight. The sight of it, lying there, seemed to deepen the shadows, stretching them along the walls, where they twisted and shifted, as though alive. My heart pounded as I sprinkled salt around us, a protective barrier to keep whatever was lurking at bay. But as the ritual began, a dark energy filled the room, a low, oppressive hum that vibrated through the air, pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. Liam's voice was shaky as he began reciting the words we'd found: a prayer, an invocation meant to cleanse the spirit, to release its hold on this world. I joined in, my voice barely steady, the unfamiliar syllables stumbling off my tongue. But as we spoke, the room seemed to resist, the air growing colder, heavier, and the light from the candles flickering wildly, casting strange, warped shadows that writhed along the walls. With each line we recited, I felt the atmosphere darken, as though Evelyn herself were fighting back, resisting our efforts to sever her hold. The room grew darker, the light from the candles nearly swallowed by the shadows that crept closer, their movements erratic and unnatural. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her, Evelyn, standing in the corner, her figure faint but unmistakable, her eyes fixed on us with a look of cold, simmering rage. Her presence filled the room with an icy chill, her hollow gaze piercing, unblinking, as if daring us to continue. Liam's voice wavered, his hands shaking as he clutched the locket, his knuckles white. "Keep going," I whispered, forcing myself to stay focused, to keep speaking the words even as fear clawed at my throat. Evelyn's figure grew clearer, more defined, her form solidifying with each passing moment, her mouth twisting into a sneer, her eyes narrowing as she moved closer, her shadow stretching toward us, long and claw-like. We reached the final part of the ritual, the part that required us to anoint the locket with holy water and place it in the center of the salt circle. My hands trembled as I poured the water over the locket, watching as the metal hissed and steamed, a faint, almost inaudible scream echoing through the room, as if something deep within the locket was writhing, fighting to escape. The air crackled with tension, the candles flaring wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to grow, stretching across the room, closing in around us. For a moment, everything went silent. The air grew still, and the shadows seemed to recede, fading back into the corners of the room. I felt a strange, tentative sense of calm, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the ritual had worked. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us lifted, and the room returned to its familiar quiet. I glanced at Liam, relief flooding through me, as I saw his shoulders relax, his breathing steadying, his eyes no longer clouded with fear. But then, as I reached out to touch his shoulder, he collapsed, falling to his knees, his hand still clutching the locket. My heart raced as I knelt beside him, panic clawing at me, fear twisting in my stomach. "Liam?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I shook him gently, desperately searching his face for any sign of recognition of life. Slowly, his eyes opened, but they were different. The vibrant, familiar spark that was Liam was gone, replaced by something cold. Empty, his gaze unfocused, his eyes cloudy and distant, as if something, or someone, were looking back through him. His mouth twisted into a faint, unsettling smile, one that didn't belong to him, and in a voice that was low, almost a whisper, he spoke. "She's here," he murmured, his words slow, deliberate, chilling. "She's always been here. And now, she's with me." A cold shiver ran down my spine as he looked up at me, his eyes blank, lifeless, filled with an emptiness that made my stomach turn. It was as if he were a stranger, a hollow shell, his body there, but his soul gone. I felt a suffocating sense of dread, the crushing realization that Evelyn hadn't left. If anything, the ritual had drawn her closer, binding her to him, to us, in a way that was more powerful, more unbreakable than ever. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, moving with a life of their own, swirling around us and filling the air with a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the walls. The candles flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes across the walls, shapes that twisted and contorted, forming ghostly faces, hollow eyes and mouths twisted in silent screams. And in the center of it all, Liam sat, his gaze fixed, unblinking, a faint, almost imperceptible grin playing at the corners of his mouth. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever horror had taken root in him, but I couldn't move, paralyzed by the realization that it was too late, that whatever we had tried to banish had only taken a firmer hold. Evelyn was here, not as a faint, distant specter, but as a living presence, a shadow that had found its vessel, a vessel she had claimed as her own. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around us, and I felt a presence, cold and unyielding, pressing in on me, filling the room with a suffocating darkness that left me gasping for breath. And as I looked into Liam's eyes, I realized with chilling clarity that he was no longer alone, and that Evelyn was here to stay. Liam's eyes remained fixed on me, cold and empty, the faintest hint of a grin stretching across his face, a grin that wasn't his. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Evelyn wasn't just haunting us. She was here, alive in him, using his body as her vessel. I could feel her presence emanating from him, a dark, stifling energy that filled the room, twisting the very air around us. All this time I'd thought she was a spirit searching for peace, that if we could break the curse, she'd finally move on. But I was wrong. Evelyn was never looking for peace. She had been waiting. Waiting for someone to find her, to bring her back into this world, to give her form again. That locket wasn't a relic to remember her by, it was a trap, a gateway. And now, because of us, she had found a way to cross over, to take what she wanted. And she had chosen Liam? I tried to reach him, calling his name, shaking his shoulders, desperate to find any trace of my friend beneath that hollow gaze. But his eyes remained cold, unfocused, his smile widening as if he were amused by my attempts. "Liam, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Fight this. Come back to me." But the thing that looked back at me wasn't Liam. He laughed, a low, twisted sound that echoed in the silence, his mouth moving. But the voice that came out was hers, a faint, mocking whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, layered beneath his own voice. "It's too late," she murmured, her voice hollow and cold. "He's mine now. He was always meant to be mine. And now, so are you." The air thickened, shadows creeping closer, filling the room with a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow everything. I backed away, horror clawing at my throat, my mind reeling with the impossible truth. Evelyn hadn't been searching for her lost love, she had been waiting for a way to cross over, to find a new vessel, someone she could control, someone who would carry her vengeance, her wrath. And Liam, he was the one she had chosen. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my senses, the weight of what I'd unleashed crushing me with a guilt so profound it felt like drowning. I brought this curse into our lives, thinking I could break it, that I could save him. But Evelyn's grasp was stronger, more unbreakable than anything I'd imagined. And now she had taken him, leaving nothing of the friend I once knew. I couldn't stay there, couldn't bear to watch as his body moved, animated by a force that wasn't his own. So I did the only thing I could. I turned and ran. I fled down the hallway, each step echoing through the empty apartment. Evelyn's voice following me, a twisted, mocking laughter that filled the silence, growing louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. I threw open the front door and stumbled out into the night, my breath coming in gasps, my heart pounding as I looked back, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me with those hollow eyes. But there was nothing. Just the empty doorway, dark and silent, the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching out as if reaching for me. And then, as I stood there, trembling, I heard it, Liam's voice, or what was left of it, echoing down the hall, laughter that was no longer his, twisted and warped, filled with a malice that was unmistakably hers. "You can run, but you'll never escape." The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place, the realization settling over me with a horror so deep it left me numb. She was free now. Free to follow, to haunt, and to spread her curse wherever she wished. And I was the one who had set her loose. I turned and stumbled down the stairs, my mind a blur of terror and guilt, the sound of that laughter echoing in my ears, following me as I fled into the night. But even as I put distance between myself and that apartment, I could still feel her presence, a shadow that lingered just out of sight, watching, waiting, as if her reach extended beyond those walls, beyond the boundaries of life and death. The last thing I remember is looking back one final time, seeing the faint, eerie glow of the locket lying on the floor in the doorway, glinting in the moonlight, almost as if it were watching me, mocking me, a reminder of the curse I had unleashed. The laughter faded, but the chill remained, settling deep in my bones, a feeling that I would never be free of her, that Evelyn's shadow would follow me, wherever I went.
Subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us for more spine-chilling tales. Don't miss out on the nightmares that await.